Right. Alex, or Alexander, welcome to Basis 93. Now, you are based with the UK column and you're Skyping us from Belgium or Holland?
From the Netherlands.
The Netherlands. Knowing so many Dutch friends, I should know that. Okay, the main thing about this is that we are discussing the elite at great detail, and that's the purpose of this discussion during our Christmas celebrations, which we've tried to get into frame, but it didn't work. So what got you involved? Now, you're from the alternative view. I think you've done a number of interviews and discussions with Ian R. Crane. Do you want to talk about that?
Certainly. I've in fact only done 2 so far, although it feels like a lot more because it's a very tight community when you get into it. But Ian R. Crane asked me to join Alternative View as a speaker for the first time at edition number 9, which was at Horwood House near Milton Keynes in May this year, May 2018. And I very much found the audience to be on the ball, very keen to discuss things on the margins of the talk. That's the whole format, really, that Ian has put together so successfully. And so he asked me for the kind of interim repeat round, which was AV 9.1, which we've just had this month, which is December 2018. And this time it was in central London. So a very interesting opportunity to say the kinds of things which are more research or works in progress, sharing them with a community of interest, which you wouldn't normally get to talk about on the UK Column News. I am, of course, a volunteer, just volunteering my time in all I do. So we all start at UK Column, those of us who present, with some background in some form of the establishment or knowledge. For some of us, it was the military, for others, intelligence. Others, again, are engineers by background, and we've come up against things that oughtn't to be so. And that's what pricked our interest, really, and brought us together. And from there, we form a community of knowledge that shares things. But, of course, we're on a daily and weekly news cycle at UK Column, and we're volunteers and we're short-handed. So Alternative View, and indeed the Basis Project, is an excellent opportunity for us to go into more depth.
Well, we have had Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy, I'm being unfair, Brian Gerrish, on with my sister channel, Caroline, the lovely, very talented Caroline Stevens. And we had Brian Gerrish on that side of the Basis project. But explain to others who really Brian is and what the UK column is, because this is a tremendous effort made by people putting a lot of effort in by their own time, spare time and things. So explain that, and then give us a background as to really why you got involved.
Well, the partnership, which is the dynamo of UK Column, is 2 remarkable guys in Plymouth. There's Brian Gerrish, who retired at the rank of Lieutenant Commander from the Royal Navy. His last post was the command of one of Her Majesty's vanishing warships, the HMS Orkney. And he left the Navy in 1993, in fact, at disgust at the Common Fisheries Policy, which he's spoken about. You'll find a lot of talks by Brian, and many of them are called State of the Nation. And then he talks about this in some detail. So he came ashore, and the long and the short of it is that he found a lot of corruption. He often calls it fraud and corruption, which is a good dual description of what he found in the city of Plymouth. One of the best examples, really, of a formerly promising industrial city far out in the English provinces, from which all hope had been cut away by the 1990s. And he particularly rubbed up against an organization which Brian is always at pains to call a political charity. Yes, it's an oxymoron, but such a thing exists, and it's favoured by the British establishment. And Common Purpose had basically bagged, reserved to itself, the territory of training leaders among young people. So they and their hangers-on did not like it at all that honest men like Brian were seeking to upskill these depressed communities, particularly the Devonport area, the old docks where the Royal Navy was losing its skills and workforce, and a lot of young people were in quiet despair. So some nasty things happened to Brian, both physical and threats and hints and insinuations. And at the end of this decades, really, of wondering what was going on, he founded the UK Column, first of all as a local newspaper called the Devonport Column. And then it's gone national since then. It's been in print. Then for a while, postal costs precluded us from printing, and we were entirely online. From 2012 onwards, we were doing daily internet news shows on TV. And that brings me to Mike Robinson, your fellow Ulsterman, who is the other part of the duo, really, because Mike has a background in the financial world.
But in here, he would know where I live, and I certainly would know where he lives, because that's what we do in Northern Ireland. We know where people live. And you're meant to be terrified.
When you say it in an Ulster accent, it sounds vaguely menacing, doesn't it?
Yes, if I tell you right now that I'm speaking to you right now on this microphone, does that not sound more intimidating than just saying, hello, how are you?
It does sound, I mean, you intimated to me before we went live where you're from, and it's a town that had lots of LVF in the past. So anyway, I'm sure you've got nothing to do with that. But no, to be serious again, Mike Robinson had been in the City of London and got very disenchanted with it. And he was away for some time, out of the country, in fact. And what brought him back was his realization that he had a duty, like I think all of us who are involved with UK Column feel this, patriotic duty, a phrase that people almost snicker about these days, but we all feel it in various ways, a duty to help spread information as to what was really going on and how the government and economists, in his case particularly, were on the wrong track in planning the country's economy and the jobs, something he's very interested in, like Brian, that people have a prospect of a decent future. So he came back to Plymouth and became the co-editor with Brian, and he's got particular technical skills as well as his extremely sharp economic analysis and general common sense of what's what. So that's the team, really, and we've picked up along the way. Really, there's three other core members, I think, David Ellis, David Scott, and myself, and in effect, we are respectively the defence correspondent, the Scotland correspondent, and the continent correspondent. And the latter two of us have got these names. David Scott uses the broadcast name of Northern Exposure, because, of course, he's north of the border and because Scotland is a very dark place now. And I call myself Eastern Approaches, which, again, is a fixed expression because of a book.
Why are you saying it's a dark place? Because one of the other interviewers that we did, a girl called Nina Valentine, her grandfather was Valentine, obviously, but he was also a bigwig in the Northeastern Health Board, and he was also a founding member of the Scottish National Party. What would you say about that if I said MK Ultra?
Well, that's a long a circle to square, shall we say? But actually, the northeast of Scotland is a place of very proud.
Well, no, this was actually northeast of England. It is.
I see.
But he was a founding member of the Scottish National Party, which I find interesting. And bearing in mind the state minder that they're talking about, as soon as you conceive, there is a carer ready to help you. Make sure you have all the inoculations and things as part of an MK Ultra programming into society.
MK Ultra mind control experimentation, unfortunately, has nestled in Scotland for a very long time. David Scott has spoken about this in more detail than I could, but you have the use of Lennox Castle near Glasgow and a doctor called Ewan Cameron, that's E-W-E-N if I remember correctly, who plugs into Canada and the United States and I think also the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which has some overlap with an NHS body in London called the Tavistock Clinic. This is all effectively a Central European idea of mind shaping, mind bending, that embeds itself in Britain around the time of the Second World War. Daniel Estulin has written an extremely good book on that, the Tavistock Institute, although the links to Scotland is not something he dwells upon. Now, Scottish nationalism is a rich and diverse phenomenon, really, with many historical reasons for it. I would recommend a pair of books by a BBC Scotland correspondent of the old school who's just passed away, called Kenneth Roy is the guy's name, and his two books describe the post-war period up to the turn of the millennium, and he traces the rise of Scottish nationalism as a legitimate set of grievances or a vision of hope, to make it less negative.
I mean, I want to make sure that people understand we're not talking about the established right of a nation to follow some path and people to campaign for that. But
foreign viewers might not realise that, less so in your native Northern Ireland, but certainly in Scotland, there was never any sense of involuntary subordination. Scotland has always politically chosen again and again to be in the Union, although there is a legitimate sense of grievance sometimes from the regions of Scotland that the central belt is telling them what to do, or a sense in Edinburgh sometimes that London is misspending its revenues, although that's very arguable.
What would you call the central belt? Are you talking about?
The central belt is the dense population area from just sort of south of the midpoint of Scotland on the west coast and stretching upwards really as to Dundee at least, and that's where more than half of the Scottish population lives in a pretty narrow band. And outside that area, Scotland is very sparsely populated, actually, for the most part.
Is that due to the Highland clearances?
Well,
Because
certainly.
we're going back a lot of time now.
Yeah, if you look at places like the Isle of Mull, today's population, its area is roughly the same as that of Greater London, and today it has only 3,000 souls living on it. And that's the same kind of loss of population that parts of rural Ireland had. Yes, the Highland clearances are part of the issue, but then that's not a bunch of evil English chasing the natives off the land. That's local Scottish Highland lairds, or in some cases newcomers, new money, deciding that sheep are more profitable than people and their old way of life. And it's a very violent and nasty history. But there's also voluntary emigration, which is often neglected, actually. A lot of Canadian research has gone into this now. A lot of people just felt that they were so depressed in the 18th century at home that they wanted, all over Ireland, actually, it's preserved in the ballads, this idea as well, that they just thought, well, we can make a better living in the new world, and they went voluntarily. So there's a rich story behind it. Scotland is a very, very diverse nation. I'm not talking about recent immigration either. Yeah. There's just many visions, many religious persuasions, many ethnicities within Scotland. But what happens to the SNP is it gets subverted. Certainly, I think from 1979 onwards, which is a crucial year in Scottish and indeed Irish nationalism, and from the time that Alex Salmond takes on the helm, dark things start to happen to the SNP, really, and ultimately it prostitutes itself so that by the time that Tony Blair's government brings in the Scottish Parliament in 1999, the Scottish Executive, or since 2007 it's called itself the Scottish Government, has been out for independence, and it has been very keen to take on the wackiest and wickedest ideas from the US Eastern Seaboard universities as to child rearing, the idea that the first 3 years of life set the tone for life and that we must intervene from conception onwards and be a nanny parent in the form of the state. These ideas, as David never ceases to point out, are not Scottish. He calls them sometimes common purpose sitting on a thistle.
Well, the whole point about that is the whole point of MK Ultra, the social management, and that's why one of the founding members is involved with it in the health service in Britain, or England, strictly. There's a lot of commonality there, if you can pun for common purpose.
Well, look, it's the British, and I have to say, more than a fair share of representation here is Scots. It's the British establishment in various forms that have wanted the domestic population and then the colonies and the Commonwealth and then the continent of Europe as well to be biddable to their will, to be economic units of production. This has a long history, really, certainly back to the 18th century.
Now, I'm not sure if you mentioned, you've already done a couple of interviews with Caroline, and they have gone live on Facebook, and we were going to do this live, but I think we've decided it's easier just to do it in it so we can. But the thing about it, I think you mentioned the Prussian situation.
Yes, for that I would recommend the books of another man who's just passed on, John Taylor Gatto, Gatto.
Now explain why. What is relevant about that and the dates, because it's important.
Yes, well, what Gatto he homes in on is the educational side of it, of what Prussia does. But Prussia basically breaks out of the old model, the old balance
what sort of
powers.
time, sorry to interrupt, but to get the context of this is down to about the 1700s, isn't it? Are we talking about now?
Yes, it is. It's Frederick the Great.
Austro-Hungarian
very
Empire?
dynamic. Now, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is the next one to the south. Prussia actually goes to war with Austria in the end and upsets the balance of power because the Austrians were Britain's allies against the French and sometimes the Russians. Now, but without getting into history for its own sake, what arises from the scene from the late 1700s is Prussia formed this new model where the young men of the state in particular are just there to be robot soldiers, an 18th century version thereof. That's where the mind control elements come in as well.
I'm going to interrupt again. Cara St. Louis did some work on that, and Cara St. Louis' mother used to edit the U.S. Naval Intelligence Journal, and then got bumped off as soon as she resigned from that or retired from that. What I'm trying to get here, there's a context of around about that time of something big happening.
Yes.
You had a number of revolutions. You had the United States, the American Revolution. You had the 1690. You had all that sort of stuff happening.
Yeah, well, I mean, you saw it all in Northern Ireland, or Ireland as a whole. You saw 1688 right through to 1798. You had a century of revolutions. Ireland very much in the wake of what's happening in the continent.
And, of course, in the context of present history, we've got King Billy on the next in line for the throne, our own so-called throne right now.
Yes, well, King Billy's an interesting one. We're talking, of course, about William III, who was the stadtholder of the United Provinces, which was the name given to the Netherlands in those days, who came over in 1688 and being
How did that happen?
I'm finding out more about this as I go along, living here in the Netherlands and being a translator of church history and theology. I thought I knew it all, actually, Miles, because I was for a while a member of the Loyal Orange institutions, the Orange Order, the Royal Black Preceptory, the Royal Arch Purple. Never a Freemason or anything like that, but I thought that was a good thing for proddies to do, until I realised that they weren't actually doing much sensible.
Well, I have to say, I have to hold my hand up. My father was an Orangeman, and he gave up for similar reasons. He was a long-established Orangeman in Northern Ireland.
Well, it's pretty desperate now. I think that the thing I'd say is there's some serious Bible students in the loyal orders, but the downfall is that they continue to allow the bandsmen, and particularly the bandsmen's girlfriends and hangers-on, to create merry hell around the marches, particularly in Glasgow and English cities as well as in Northern Ireland. And so that puts people off. I mean, there was a time when a third of the male population of some provinces of Canada was members of the Orange Order, so it's not a dodgy little secret club. Certainly not in its historical terms. But what these men commemorate, of course, is William III coming from Holland. But you were going to say something, sorry.
I mean, there is the ancient Hibernian or Order of Hibernians in Ireland, and they have their marches as well. The important thing, there's a very important book, which I've spoken about before, called Ireland, Land of the Pharaohs, done by the late Andrew Power, who was an Illuminati. He reached Illuminati level. But he explains in that book all about the symbols which the Orange Order hold, and really the ancient information was going back to Egypt on that.
Well, this is the Scottish side of the Irish heritage, actually. It's your forebears, really, the Scots-Irish, as they're known in America, or the Ulster Scots. They bring over, particularly when they convert to a very, should we say, zealous form of Calvinism during the 17th century, they bring over to their Ulster plantations with them this idea of being a chosen people. And there's more generally a sense in Scotland of descent from Scotia, who is held to have been a princess of Egypt. And some people connect that with Jeremiah's migration away from Israel and Judah when they were captured, Judah in his particular case. So that has a long history behind it, which David Scott is keen to go into detail on, because he's quite a keen student of these areas of history and legend, national self-image, shall we say. So what it ends up with is that Scottish...
Andrew's book was connecting us to matrix reality.
Well, absolutely, because there's a very powerful magic, some potent stuff going on in Scottish Rite Freemasonry, in which, in a certain sense, all the loyal orders, particularly the Orange Order and the Royal Arch Purple, are spin-offs or pale imitations of Scottish Freemasonry in particular, because there's various kinds of it. And as you've remarked already, the 18th century is a time when Bavarian Illuminism and French revolutionary Freemasonry partners up with the Scots, really, and causes havoc all over Britain and the continent. And particularly England gets hemmed in. It's the only conservative country that remains, actually, true with a traditional constitution after all of this stuff has ended. What is crucial about this, I think, is that Scottish Freemasonry takes hold, including in the United States, and it has a very strong interest in moulding people to its will. I must stress that it's far from the case that everyone involved in Freemasonry or even Scottish Rite Freemasonry has evil intent, but the controlling minds very much have evil intent. And I should just round off what I was saying about William III. You asked about that. Well, it was the Protestants of all three realms, Ireland, Scotland and England, who invited William III of Holland to come in to take over the crown when James the Seventh and Second vacated the throne of England.
The important thing is he was seventh and second because he was the second James of England, but the seventh one of Scotland. Is that right?
Correct. And the last,
and that's when we had the Act of Union.
Kingdom. The Act of Union happens one reign later under Queen Anne in 1707.
Yeah, but they were around about that
toward it begin, and you're quite right, Miles. People would poo-poo what you just said, and they would say, "Oh, there was no vision of that in 1688, 1690." But they're wrong, because I look into the Dutch sources now, some of which I translate for professional historians, and I find that actually, as soon as James the Seventh and Second acceded to the throne in 1685, he was only destined to reign for 3.5 years. There was actually a mission of 4 Dutch diplomats, or more correctly, 3 Dutch diplomats and a reformed churchman, who came along as the 4th member of the party. He got diplomatic accreditation, although he wasn't a statesman. Their ostensible reason for being there was to congratulate James VII on having taken up the throne, succeeding his brother. And while they're there, the three genuine diplomats do their hobnobbing at the court of St. James's, and the churchman involved, Hermann Vitius, goes around the independent and Presbyterian churches of London, which of course are mostly Welsh, Scottish and Irish in membership, and says, "Psst, if there's a Dutch coup, would you support it?" Of course, the carrot that's dangled is you will be given in a situation where the Anglicans no longer have supremacy. Well, of course, that promise was half kept, half broken, because they were not really given full emancipation after the Revolution. They were only merely tolerated, and it took another couple of 100 years until a non-Anglican could graduate from Oxbridge, for example. This might sound so arcane to some, but
the Anglicans are effectively, but the Anglicans are effectively still Catholic. As such,
yeah,
we got a little bit into
because it's the only denomination of Christendom which calls itself both Protestant and Catholic.
Well, there's Roman Catholic, there's a crucial connection there with what is the basic difference, because this is important in terms of the Vatican and its power and control, and where the name Vatican comes from. It comes from a Druidic Irish source, doesn't it?
Yes, I don't know about an Irish word connection, but vatus in Latin, if I remember correctly, does in fact mean a diviner. But certainly
it comes from the Druid, the ancient Druid.
I don't know about etymology, but the idea of the Vatican is it is a part of the city, or one of the seven hills of Rome, where, should we say, holy men in pagan times hung out.
Have you heard of Loch Derg?
Oh, yes. I know that's right in the west of County Tyrone on the border with Donegal, isn't it? And they still have pilgrimages there.
And are you aware of the portal that's at Loch Derg and the fake version of that, which has got the church bits on it, and the other island, which doesn't, where the real portal is?
I hadn't heard that detail, Miles, but it doesn't surprise me because, it's only recently I've started looking into aspects of ley lines and the magic geography of the British Isles. It's not something I was encouraged to study as my particular brand of Christianity growing up. But now, without at all turning my back on what I've been taught through life, I think I can understand some of what is going on here and about the energy that's involved, although it's
well, there is a portal. And Barry Fitzgerald in Ireland has done the research on this. There is a portal in Loch Derg where the Church of Rome has its structures and its monastery. I think there's a monastery. Now I remember.
Now you're talking about this, I seem to recall that the Roman Catholics have a pilgrimage location in one location on Loch Derg and the Anglicans on another. Is that correct?
They may. I'm not sure about that, but certainly the actual portal, which was reactivated by researchers using certain, I won't say it because I don't want people to go there and muck around. That's what the Celtic cross is about. It's about a cavern, a round building or cavern. That's what you get in a long barrow, with three nodes for resonance purposes, and then the entrance to that is the column of the so-called cross, and you enter the barrow through that, and then you stand at the entrance to the round bit, and you do something, and you can gate things in.
Well, this is exactly the point of commonality with ancient Egyptian astrology and religion, isn't it? The idea of portals, which I don't think the Babylonians even had, although they were far more accomplished astrologers and astronomers than the Egyptians. It seems to have been only the Egyptians, and arguably their spiritual descendants in Scotland and Ireland, who had the idea of actually porting yourself from locations on Earth right into a position in the stars. At least your soul, if not your body.
Now, I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say about that, because that's one of the most crucial features about the Vatican, because they copied that portal, and that's what they have in Rome. And they also shut down access to all the other portals in the rest of Ireland.
Well, biblically, you see, if you look at the book of Daniel and, again, Revelation, all the ancient empires, the classic five, the line of five, is Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and the Egyptians are not part of that lineage because they kind of sit as a cul-de-sac in some areas. But all of that heritage, the knowledge is taken to Rome. The Library of Alexandria is sacked. We don't know really what happened, but in any case, Rome becomes the possessor of the knowledge and the magisterium, the authority of all these ancient empires, and then it subsumes a form of the church as well, so that these patrician families, these old bloodlines, also claim authority to be patrons of the church as well as of the state. And then I think one of the best researchers on this is Joseph P. Farrell, although I'm not quite sure what his own convictions are these days, but his information, I think, is second to none. You have to sift what he says carefully, but he's one of these who points out, and also a recent guest on Richard D. Hall's channel spoke about this at a great length as well. They points out that the idea of ancient Egyptian religion, arguably, as you're saying, Roman, Vatican religion, and Celtic religion, one of the ideas is to form direct links. I don't understand what the physics is supposed to be here, but it's what's important is that it's believed by the practitioners. Links so that one can, either after death or just during meditation, put one's soul and or body out in a particular location in the universe.
Well, that's the whole point of the standing stones.
Well, you could say so. Because
And the tribe of Dan, don't lose the point here. The crucial thing about this is John Irwin, who was special forces. He was from up north. His team went to Egypt to find stuff in Cairo, bumped off an awful lot of Russians, very highly skilled, and he was taken beyond death to be trained in his special forces military things. This is 1957. And the purpose of what he found in 1957 with his team was ancient documents in crystal lattice databanks, which gave you access to those portals.
That is all of a piece with what I have heard. I must stress most of what I am picking up about this, and I'm still chewing over it in my mind, comes from Farrell, or the sources that Farrell points out. And one of the best sources is a 20-hour mammoth interview that he did with a US radio station called The Cosmic War, which people can find as a playlist on YouTube. Goes into great detail on these issues.
Yeah. Well, that was British military doing that, 1957, with a non-human training their special forces people.
Yes, I mean, what are these identities of these non-humans? I mean, if you're consistent, as I am, with the biblical record, you don't have to call them aliens or extraterrestrial
Very
beings.
important.
Very
important.
They can be creations of Nephilim. They can be genetic experiments between demons and human bodies. There's indications of this in Genesis 6:4.
Well, there's indications of that data in an encrypted document about Stockholm, where some kind of reptilians were working with the church of the time in Stockholm to actually, the first thing to do to get things worked out was to change the eye. They had difficulty shape-shifting into the eye would be sustained. Have you heard of anything like that?
Well, you hear of other testimonies of people who have seen shape-shifting, and it is the eye, that the holding of the gaze, which gives it away. I think because, I mean, to use biblical language again, the eye is the window of the soul. You know, it's what we are throughout our whole history focused on investigating and getting a sense of whether someone is legitimate or not. So to be able to fake that is extremely highly advanced technology, isn't it?
Well, that was released by an agent called Lincoln by the NSA, and the encryption of the document is very precise in that not all the lines are written at exactly the same horizontal line. So there's number coding with the lines, and there's number coding with the letter slanting, and the whole thing. There's a lot of encoding in that.
Yes, multiple iterations, I suppose. Yeah. Recursive encoding, I suppose you'd call it. Yes.
But going back to, we're leaping from one century and culture to another, but essentially we're all leaping about basically Irish origins of civilization. The point is that whatever was in Ireland connected with the survivors from Egypt.
Now that I think is very much beyond doubt. You can trace from, I think it's a particular site in Egypt, from Karnak, if I'm not mistaken, or no, sorry, from Giza. You can trace a great circle, and you'll easily find maps of this online as well. And seeding out from Egypt, equidistant in different directions, are smaller circles of sites, one of which is the whole of the British Isles along the Michael's ley line out to Skellig Michael of County Kerry, passing through Stonehenge.
Where Star Wars was there quite recently. Disney using Star Wars so that the viewers of the films are accessing that energy. And we have a wonderful researcher out there called Kathy Morgan, who did a huge amount of work on all this. And she's a blood relative of King William.
Yes, well, I mean, I'm getting a sense here that the Williamite line may be something actually a lot darker than we thought it was, which is a particular horror to, the kind of Presbyterian like me who believed that he came to save us. And I've got some sense now of what Hilaire Belloc meant when he wrote his controversialist biography of James II in the English numbering, who in the first line of his biography calls him the saviour of the English Navy and the last monarch to rule with good conscience. Of course, it's a controversialist Catholic position to argue that, but at least the Stuarts didn't indebt themselves to foreigners. They actually had some sense of the unity of crown and people, which the subsequent Germanic occupiers of it haven't had.
Yeah, well, there's so many topics we're crossing there, because also down to the southwest corner of Ireland is well known as a massive ET facility down there, and a lot of UFOs seen there only in the last few weeks.
Well, another data point for you on that, I think, Miles, is, and this might relate to the EU military unification project as well, is that there's some in the know in the British Army, and we know that there are parts of the British military where Satanism is particularly overrepresented. The Red Caps are one, the military police.
I think that's putting it mildly, especially with the United States military. You're being very genteel with your words.
In the US, it's the Navy seems to take the lead in this stuff.
Navy's a senior service.
Seems to suffer. Yes, exactly. In Britain, I think it's more the darkness seems to reside more in parts of the army and the military police. But we do know from some military sources that there are British military officers who have intimate knowledges of the west of Ireland airports, including those that have only recently been built, such as Knock in County Mayo, which ostensibly was there to allow a label pilgrimage again to another shrine, of course, right there in Knock, but may have had another reason to be built. But of course, if there were to be a requirement for the Irish ports to be taken by the British or European military force to deny use of them to the Russians or any other adversary, then the first thing to be done would be pounce on the West of Ireland airfields, Knock, Shannon and Cork, and perhaps one in County Kerry as well, a smaller one.
There is a rather high representation of Russians and Americans around that area, but that's because of the facility off the southwest of Ireland. There's 300 miles off the coast.
There's hydrocarbons. They've called it the Celtic Sea these days. It's an area that didn't really have a name of its own in hydrography, but it's got such untapped resources that since the 70s it's had its own name.
Well, Bantry
and of
Bay.
Course, it's a shallow continental shelf there. Off the west of Ireland, you have a huge area people don't think about, which was only covered by water something like 7,000 years ago, if I'm correct.
Yeah, that's an active base, ET. Cork, if you want to find out about UFOs, go to Cork, but that was also Churchill's Cork, the ports, that was part of the things. They were only released to the Irish Republic. They were still part of the Commonwealth, I think, until World War II.
The treaty ports, the Republic was neutral during De Valera's term as Taoiseach during the Second World War, and so we weren't able to overfly Donegal flying out or sailing out of Londonderry. We had to stay out of the area. But through the Second World War, there was the use of the treaty ports, what's now called Cove, C-O-B-H, near Cork, which was Queenstown in those days, wasn't it? Yeah. And Dunleary, I think, was another, if I'm not mistaken. But these were very important, not just because they were sheltered natural harbours on the Atlantic convoy route, but I think also because some stuff was going on there of a more esoteric nature.
Very, very, very much so. There's a lot we're covering here. What about the Emperor Flavius and the foundation of Christianity on the Roman Church, going from multi-gods to single god?
Well, this is a fantastically controversial area. One thing I would say is there's sincere Christians in every denomination. I mean, I'm in touch personally with some very sincere old-fashioned Roman Catholics, as in old-fashioned to the extent that they don't like the Pope and the current Vatican one whit, and they actually think they're satanic. But from that right through to Protestants and atheists, you've got people who inform me very, very well on what's been going on in church setups, I think. But there's clearly a time at which the late pagan Roman Empire and its emperors latch on to this growing form of Christianity that's present in Rome and want to subvert it.
I mean, my Joseph Atwell wrote a great work on that. I think he would have been, the Emperor Flavius would have been the Tony Blair of the era. Been able to reinvent new labour. He reinvented the Roman Empire as Christianity.
Yeah, and there's a certain sense in which Roman paganism is reinvented as a form of Christianity. It co-opts what's already there, or it places Egyptian and Babylonian mythology, such as Semiramis, onto the fledgling religion of Christianity. I think that's beyond doubt.
And I mean, this King James II, was he the man who rewrote the Bible? Is that the one?
Oh no, that you're thinking of his
King James.
He was the younger brother of Charles II, and therefore he was the grandson of James VI and First, who was the man who commissioned the authorized version. On this point, there is a lot of misinformation put out. The authorized version is translated directly from the best manuscripts we have in the source languages, and there's a lot of claims that King James just rewrote the Bible. People get away with that in an age of ignorance, but there's no truth in that. And likewise, people will claim these days. You see a growing attachment to this idea that some certain Roman patricians. Often you hear the name. What is it now? I forget. Publius something was the name of it. It'll come to me in a moment. Was the patrician in question supposedly wrote the New Testament in order to keep people enslaved and just pretended that it was a Jewish composition from Palestine, whereas in fact it had been produced in Rome. Well, that's just takes no account of the background of biblical scholarship at all. There's a lot of information available to disprove that.
Well, we've bounced around a few things here. Let's get down to business in terms of the present history, the present day, which is, we've got the government being held in contempt as this time in December 2016, why am I saying 16? Maybe it's a Freudian slip for 19. Anyway, don't go there. The point is that the purpose from now on in this discussion is what context do these societies and the connections that you've been able to discuss, for instance, at AV 9.1, you were mentioning two factions. Can we sort of establish who's who, why they're doing what they're doing? And, we talk about the Illuminati. The Illuminati are pretty pissed off that their higher knowledge and spirituality has been essentially hijacked by some pretty nasty things. I do some filming for the Francis Bacon Society, and it's clear that at the time of Francis Bacon, they were encoding a lot of stuff for a very important reason.
Yes, it is. First of all, maybe just give an indication more of your position on this, because there'll be things you know a lot more than I do. Would your contention be that Sir Francis Bacon himself was a man who wanted to do good with the wisdom he had, and that his knowledge has been, his legacy has been subverted later?
Yes.
Yes, I've heard a lot of people arguing that, and I have respect for that position, I think, because he's such a genius, really, in his essays and his
one researcher, and he did deliver a very good presentation that bases on crop circles, a lot of connections on crop circles made by men, people putting things in the ground and doing things, but also a lot of other dodgy stuff going on there without going further than that, is that the logic to some of Francis Bacon's material is that he was a time traveller. There was knowledge which was available at certain times which could not have been available in that time, but was available elsewhere in the future.
There has been suggestions of this, and of course one of his seminal works is New Atlantis, where he's talking about the rise of the Americas as a new scientifically based continent with a new kind of civilization. And that does seem, there's been different arguments about it, it does seem to be a benign vision in which science is put to the good of people rather than forming elites.
Well, having shot a lot of that material for the Francis Bacon Society, I do encourage people to look at those lectures online. They're very, very interesting. It's only been done in the last 3 years. But, we're dealing with a crisis right now, and you've delivered a couple of lectures at Alternative View, 9 and 9.1. Let us have it. What's the crux of what you're talking about?
The crux is really that we have, to my mind, at least two factions of elite. One perhaps less nasty than the other, but I don't think either of them has good intents in mind. One is based on the thinking of Aristotle, but it perverts his thinking, and the other is based on Plato's thinking and perverts that, because there's an element of honest inquirer to both Aristotle and Plato. Like a lot of great thinkers in history, both in philosophy and religion, it's the followers or factions of followers who give the guy a bad name. But the Aristotelians have been dominant in the sea powers, Britain, France, in fact Japan as well, and certainly Israel, to the extent that we think of it as a secular Zionist European-based idea. And this is, there's a complex of ideas in this Aristotelian elitism, but it's basically keep people poor and stupid and tell them that God is on the side of the rulers, and ultimately they cooperate with Satan, is the idea. The Platonists have a slightly more enthusiastic vision of mankind. They want to give mankind more prosperity, get him involved in infrastructure projects, and to break the power supposedly of these satanic Aristotelian elites. But the Platonists themselves can degenerate into making man a slave. They do so more through cults and mind control rather than through religion.
Is that because of the basic psychopathic nature of people who take control of these things?
Yeah, we're a fallen world, and the test for mankind through the eras has always been, what will we do with the state of enlightenment we have? Are we going to be beast-like with it, or demonic with it, or are we going to be more godlike with it?
Well, there's been
And
a lot of encouragement in the past. Like if you were a Cathar or you had some enlightenment, there was slight encouragement from Rome to dissuade you from doing so, by like
yes,
burning you
yeah,
alive slowly.
absolutely. There's been some very wicked eras in the history of Europe and of the other continents as well, really. But the remarkable thing is that man's genius and his will to know more of the world has not been diminished by this threat.
Okay, well, continue with these two factions, and list
Yes.
them if you can.
Well, I think that when we have writers talking about bloodlines, which they allege are satanic bloodlines, particularly Fritz Springmeier and Robin de Ruyter, who both talk about 13 top satanic bloodlines, my contention is that they are really describing the Aristotelian side of the elitist model. So these are the guys who believe in fiat currency and educating people to be cattle, basically, and telling them that they have no spirit and they're really only just bodies, and that the powers that be should never be questioned, which is not actually what the Bible teaches. It's a perversion of that. So that I think is what we're more familiar with. And in the last decade, we've seen an explosion of understanding of some of the leading families in this model, including the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that that is all that there is to elitism. There is also, particularly based in Germany, Russia, China, a more Eurasianist or Prussian or Platonist school of thinking, which appears tentatively or tantalizingly to be more promising to us, because it doesn't want to abuse us in Satanist rituals or whatever, but it does still want to capture our hive mind and to put us at the service of our rulers rather than our own interests.
You mentioned hive mind. That's AI.
It is, isn't it? AI, I think, is actually almost more of a Platonist than an Aristotelian model of elitism, because the Platonists at their extreme want to be sheer mind freed of the body, which goes right back to Plato himself, who says in Greek, soma, sema, the body is a tomb, a very negative view of physicality.
Okay, well, with Caroline, you mentioned quite a few different names of families. I mean, the Rothschilds are getting a bit of a bad rap, or maybe they deserve it. I don't know. But I mean, the thing is that how many others are we dealing with, and what's wrong with these people who are simply well educated? They know a few things, and they happen to worked hard. They've done, told whatever. They've got their businesses and they've made a lot of money. What's really wrong with that, or what's wrong? Why should they be feared? Or
I think they're possessed. I think they're driven from generation to generation, and I think a lot of the poor members of this family, these families, suffer horrendous things from birth onwards and don't actually want to be involved in it, but have no choice. And I'll go through the 13 lines for you, actually, in alphabetical order. This is Springmeier and de Ruyter's list: Astor, Bundy, Collins, DuPont, Freeman, Kennedy, Lee, spelled either L-I or L-E-E, Onassis, Rockefeller, Rothschild or Rothschild, Russell, von Daun, D-U-Y-N, von Daun, and the Merovingians. So these are all basically, they come out of various parts of the British Isles, a lot of Scottish and Irish influence in them as well. Some are pure English, and some come from the Frankish area of the continent. But they often migrate to the US from there. Interestingly, the first in the list alphabetically, the Astors, which are thought of as, very, very English, actually, according to Springmeier and de Ruyter and some of the sources they quote, came from Catharia, the area of southern France, where the Cathar movement got going, and then they went to the Black Forest.
Now, what's the significance of that?
Well, I think the Black Forest is a place where you can hide out. It's less enlightened, shall we say. So they
were being rounded up by Rome. Why were they such a threat? Why does this? Why? I mean, on the one hand, these illuminated means illuminated with wisdom. They are high-minded beings who are shining ones. What went wrong?
I think what they were getting into was, and I'm not a physicist, but I think, again, the thing is what is believed to be the case by the practitioners, rather than being able to indicate that it's scientifically accurate. I think what they were getting into, or what they were perceived by the Roman opponents as getting into, was a use of vital energy, which takes on the many names Vril or Qi in China or Reiki. And often, you see communities of people in history who, through dance and other forms of physical and even sexual togetherness, feel this electrical charge between them as a couple or as a group. And we hear often that a huge amount of energy and spirituality comes out of that encounter. And I think that's what the Cathars were onto, because, of course, it was a high point in civilization. 13th century France, particularly the Mediterranean part of France, was really the center of world trade and knowledge at that time. So it wasn't a backwater by any stretch of the imagination. People think of the south of France now as really rural and bucolic. But these guys were actually at the crossroads of all the ancient knowledge coming out of the Near East, some knowledge perhaps of the New World from the Portolano sailors that were coming into northern Italy and France at that time. So it's a kind of attitude among the Aristotelians, I think, of hang on, if these guys know what prospects are out there, we can't control them, because the whole point of Aristotelian elitism is to shrink people's horizons and have closed, stitch-up markets.
Or dark age.
Yeah, well, it was a dark age. It certainly was. I mean, by the 13th century, Europe had, certainly France had emerged from that and was going through massive prosperity and knowledge. But then that soon gets reversed, of course, with various calamities the next century.
I mean, we seem to have lost 1,000 years in darkness.
I remember a chap in the south of Ireland telling me, and he was a Freemason of the honest kind. I don't think he knew about the high-ups in Freemasonry being wicked. He told me that if the Vatican hadn't been in charge of the world, we would have been on the moon by 1400. Of course, the question is, did we go to the moon? But I think the point is well made.
Have we been there already? Some people say our souls go there. And Saturn. Could you explain, from your point of view, the difference between Saturn, Lucifer, and I think Beelzebub? Are these different characters?
There's many different characters. I think the biblical record makes it clear that Satan is chief of the evil angels. I think that the majority view, which I would endorse as well, is that Saturn is a representation of him in the classical pantheon, Greco-Roman pantheon. There's also a rebellion of him and his cohorts against the older gods being another layer of demons, really, which is the clash of the Titans in Greek mythology. And you have Kronos and the devouring of the father god by the sun god in Greco-Roman mythology. So that's I think what's gone on there. There's been waves of overturning of the demons. And to get back to the Platonists again, one of the things that is dangerous about these Platonist elitists, they look very tempting because they're promising greater prosperity for all. When they get into Aryan mythology, or the misuse thereof, and the totalitarian regimes often talk about Aryan ideology in some form or another. What they're talking about is basically this old idea of let us throw off the rule of Satan and his angels, and indeed of anything that calls itself God, and we'll be gods to ourselves. And of course that creates a huge bloodlust in the world, and the end justifies the means is the thinking then.
Well, blood being the operative word. I mean, there's literally they devour. They have these rituals and things. But I mean, there have been certain people saying that certain military are embracing this in a big way because they're operating in the domain of these other beings.
Yes, it's a frightening conclusion to reach, but there have been some testimonies from various countries suggesting that there's been some serious research or eagerness among some senior military officers and strategists to think, why can't we tap directly into the satanic way of being so that we can slip the bonds of space-time, or at least the confines of our own corporeality?
I mean, the
next step is to collude with demonic forces and beings which may have physical existence as well, which it seems to have happened at least in the Third Reich and possibly in the US since the war, and who knows, even Britain.
Could you explore that? I mean, and one of the aspects of one of the other researchers, Michael Shrimpton, sort of essentially the plot for Europe and the whole thing was there was a secret organization which was running the show on all this and still does run the show right up to the cabinet office in this country, which is why the whole EU thing here is collapsing.
Well, I mean, I've been in the cabinet office and dealt with some very upfront people who are the assessors of intelligence. I found them very measured. But
what do you mean by that? And how did you get there? Were you did you work for
GCHQ officer? So I was.
Sorry, I talked over you there. God forbid.
Yeah, I was an officer of GCHQ, Britain's Signals Intelligence Agency, and only a junior desk level officer, going in from time to time for intelligence assessment meetings, preparatory to the weekly Joint Intelligence Committee meetings, which is by the heads of the intelligence agencies. And when it was a subject that I was responsible for, I would be there at the table at the pre-meeting. And my sense was that the Cabinet Office assessments staff, as they're called, are actually a very uncorrupted and highly educated and well-meaning group of people. But I did get a sense whenever I entered the building that there were other forces in the building. And this has been reinforced ever since. Our UK column work has found again and again that whatever the spear tip of wickedness is, it often resides in some committee of the Cabinet Office.
Now that's very serious.
Oh, it is.
Explain.
Because the Cabinet Office was, well, I mean, the Cabinet Office was set up in the early 20th century to give a kind of central focus to the British government, which is contrary to our common law. It's for us to be all dictated to out of a single body. It's even contrary to the continental ideas of separation of powers. And these days, the Cabinet Office as a body, as a blob, has arrogated to itself a lot of the functions which ought to be exercised by Her Majesty, or at least by Buckingham Palace. The Crown powers are effectively reserved to the Cabinet Office because the Cabinet Office controls Her Majesty's government, tells the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's staff what to do in some areas, and hides in the shadows and does things that the Prime Minister's too busy or distracted to do. And of course, the Queen is supposed to do certain things in her own name or in the people's name, but she, especially now she's old and distracted, gives a lot of these duties to the government. And she's also told, well, you're a constitutional monarch, you can't involve yourself. So de facto, it's people in the Cabinet Office who exercise a lot of powers. A good example is the Law Lords were rolled over into something falsely called the Supreme Court of England and Wales. And of course, there's a Scottish equivalent as well. The Supreme Court for Scotland is the Court of Session, except in in criminal matters. That is also the Supreme Court of in London covers them now. When this was being put together, one of the law lords whose role was being changed or abolished said, look, we're giving this the title Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court already exists in England and Wales, and if we give it this name, it will be duping the people because it does not have the functions of a Supreme Court. The real judicial functions of being the absolute court of cassation still reside with the Crown and therefore by de facto in the Cabinet Office.
It seems that we've got a recipe for somebody taking control of our society with nefarious intent and running it very effectively.
Oh yes, these grey and unremarkable men of the civil service in certainly the early 20th century, by that time a lot of them seem to have been out-and-out Satanists at the highest rank. And others had a more prosaic, technocratic idea that we were really just not up to ruling ourselves, and it would be far better for us to be run by superior chaps like them. And these men form easy prey for demonic forces because they're the kind who flatter themselves that evil doesn't actually exist and that there's nothing in the mind. It's all physicality anyway, and they can easily be manipulated.
Well, there are views in physics about 8-dimensional physics, and that's why an alien can walk through your wardrobe, because even if it's from some other star cluster system somewhere. Any views on that? Any backdoor information on that?
Well, I'm not even an amateur physicist. I simply read with interest and listen with interest to what's said, but I can't stack it up, really. I don't have the background to go on. I'm just aware that the common point between all these claims made is the idea that actually space-time, or some people call it the medium, so our 4 dimensions, if you include time, is actually something bendable, and it can be twisted or even penetrated by certain applications of forces. And if you understand that in the very general layman's sense, then it does kind of allow for some of these observed phenomena or experiences people have had from a number of things we've been talking about.
Well, I would ask the viewer to look at Tom Bearden's work. Mike Emery, who's worked with Tom Bearden, he's published a very good book, Scalar Energetics, Scalar Warfare, the concept of scalar energetics and how you can get two normal 3D forces and collapse them, and you have a scalar, non-time dependent energy field. So you're already out there.
For the layman, well, I'm a layman myself, but the people new to this, the idea of scalar is that conventional mainstream physics, as I understand it, says that things have to be vectors, they have to be projected, energy has to go ping. But that disregards, is the argument, the idea that the medium itself can be tensed, flexed, and tossed taught it, I think
Well,
is the
the
word.
Russians know all about it. They're doing a lot of work on it. Torsion
This
fields.
the Second World War, yes. And so this in some versions this leads people to say, well, look, any 2 points in the universe or any pair of particles is interconnected no matter how far apart they are. And generally, scalar is the idea of sending something almost instantaneously ping across this tensed medium like a taut wire along which you send any kind of vibrational energy. That's how I understand it. Perhaps you could refine that for me. But this idea was actually mainstream in late 19th century Cambridge physics because Maxwell came out with his quaternion equation.
Exactly.
With an ON on the end. And these equations were then rewritten supposedly to make them easier for the next generation of students. And the inclusion of the scalar was completely taken out then. So that if there was a private club emerging around the years of around 1900 to take physics off the books, then that would be a perfect way of doing it.
Now, who would that be? JP, he had a Titanic thing. If you held a party on a boat, got rid of all his rivals, JP
There's
Morgan.
So much going on in that area.
If I said petrochemical industry, and would that somehow feed other people?
This would bring us back to some of those 13 families we were just discussing, wouldn't it? But I don't think they're the top level of things. I think they're just enjoying the spoils. Certainly, I think that their leading representatives in any generation will go along with a plot to get rid of inconvenient people. But I don't think that makes them the masterminds of the thing. I think more and more we get data in about this, we're seeing that it's actually the Roman patrician families, who are the successors, genetic or at least spiritual successors to the wizards of the ancient world. These are the men who really run the show, I think. They don't inhabit these economic clans, these foremost business lines. They want to be rather more obscure than that.
Well, based on what you've been saying, I mean, could you summarize, just back to AV, because your presentation at AV9 and your presentation, we've scooped a little bit of it on AV 9.1. What if people want to get the DVD from Ian R. Crane? It's all available. Could you go over what you discussed there in this sort of second part of the show?
Yeah. Ultimately, I was talking about fiefdoms and cartels and cabals in AV9. And that DVD is available now. The AV 9.1 one, I think, will be out fairly shortly. But the AV9 talk was much more about fiefdoms, cartels. That is, how bloodlines, within their own model, they say, okay, you're responsible for this area. For example, one takes petrochemicals, another takes mind control, another takes supremacy in religion. But then they rub up against other ethnic groups or other parts of the world that have their own cartel system and their own spookery. And so when you rub up for the first time against the Chinese or the New World, you have to cut a deal with the key players there. That was the canvas I was painting on at AV9, and it goes back at least to the Ice Age, to the end of the last Ice Age, certainly the 12,000 years before present.
Now, how do you get the data to discuss that? Where do you get that?
The main field, I think, that makes it incontrovertible, plausible plus, I think, is geoglyphs, which is that in stone, there's some very old civilizations, such as the Etruscans, who set these very accurate bearings in stone, saying our territory is out to there. And the Etruscan ones, for example, talk about or make mention of extreme points like Shetland, the Canary Islands, the northeast and southwestern points of what's now the USA. This ties into the idea that the Knights Templar and the Portuguese, the same operation really, had what's now the USA even marked out as separate from what's now Canada, even before the discovery of the New World. So there was already a Canada, US, Mexico tripartite division of who owned what before any Europeans got there.
So how do people have a plan for something that nobody's discovered?
Well, it has to be run through a small number of initiated families and be either oral knowledge or kept on very secure bits of paper, which do seem to have existed. And I think a lot of this goes on in Italy. You get these patrician families from generation to generation, from century to century, who carry on mystic knowledge. Sometimes they don't even really know what they're talking about, I think, but they preserve the knowledge until the physics catches up, the overt physics, and then they can apply the knowledge again.
So how did you find out about the way that Maxwell's equations were banjaxed?
That comes from the way that Farrell has outlined it, because ordinarily I wouldn't go into physics. It's something that I have too much respect to dabble in, as it were. But it's presented cogently enough there for me to think, okay, I'll entertain that idea, and that takes me further.
And where do you think this is taking us? Because we're facing a planet where we're running out of our foods are being poisoned, all that sort of stuff. Where does your work take us in the future?
I think this is a particularly dark day, and I think if we do not realize and act upon the knowledge in peaceful and lawful ways that we have, that we are being milked or farmed and set up for destruction, then we will in fact, be culled like cattle. I think it's already happening. I think 5G is a very clear example of that. It's deliberately being put in place certainly by those in the know at the top, to render us infertile and to make us mind controllable.
How do you? What leads you to this conclusion? I mean, it's just mobile phones. It's just ordinary radio waves. People are using their phones all over the place. Nobody seems to be affected by this.
5G, of course. So, again, I'm not a physicist, but I will point to those who know more. I would point to Mark Steele with an E on the end. I don't know whether you have interviewed him, the campaigner from Gateshead, who has been in lots of judicial trouble because he has not shut up when he's been ordered to by the great and good about this. What he points to is that this is a battlefield technology, and it's based not on the previous generations of technology of communication from mast to cell, from cell mast to recipient unit, but it is a phased array. A bunch of beams actually focusing in. In a grid pattern, focusing in on the individual.
Like those windmills, the way they're all sort of in regular positions, and then they collect the radio ELF stuff. I don't want to get too specific.
Yeah, so it's of a different order of magnitude.
I think the point about it is about the cars, with the radar signals coming off cars. They're all going to mean equidistant distance from them, because they are all equally far apart, and then all their radar signals operate as a phased array of moving cars with that radar pulses.
Yeah,
phased array is a way of getting things together which would be small, and by using the phase and adding the things together, you get a huge signal.
Mm-hmm. Which, of course, is then what the body is exposed to, and the mind.
So what about AI? What does your... I mean, you're looking at this from two perspectives: the Christian point of view and also the historical point of view, based on your work and your connection to tell us. Where do you think that's taking us?
Well, I think that both of the legs to stand on that you just mentioned, the Christian and the historical attitude to elitism and conspiracy, they both tell us that the mind is a hive mind, whether we like it to be or not. Evil has a neural reality to it. Evil ideas can hop from people from one to another telepathically if you expose yourself to that kind of influence, if you make yourself receptive to them. And there was a long time when one or two branches of Christianity said, well, is the devil just a metaphor for the evil that the mind can come up with when it networks sufficiently? There's a tremendous amount of power in the human mind, and we were just discussing the ways in which waves and particles can actually be in contact with each other, in ways that aren't evident to classic physics, apparently. So all this adds up to, I think, is the idea that you can actually, use a population to think your own thoughts for you and to carry out your own deeds.
Well, that seems to be happening at the moment. Are we talking about, what exactly are you talking about when you're mentioning that?
I'm talking about getting a whole generation or a whole society to act in certain ways. This is the power of cultural Marxism, in particular, is that you make certain things unthinkable and unsayable. George Orwell writes about it very cogently because he picked up a lot of this chatter from the BBC. And then you've actually not just taken words out of people's vocabulary, you have made them a fundamentally different being. Certainly on a collective or societal level, you've rendered them biddable in certain ways to perform certain things, because the language and thought that they have inside them makes that the thing to do.
Well, we've been discussing this in view of the Prussians. That's 300 years ago. Or
it starts 300 years ago, and certainly by the time they introduced their obligatory schooling in the 1870s, a little earlier in the case of Prussia, but it gets rolled out to Anglo-Americans in the 1870s, what they're doing is they're specifically saying, we are going to mold our young people, most particularly our young men, so that they are good little workers who do as they're told and don't think, and good little fighters. So that's been scientifically studied, I think,
Well,
or
that's
refined to a T.
the Industrial Revolution needed workers. They needed an educated middle class to operate all
Yeah.
these new machines. And but
Look
what is
look
that?
at the US or the Ruhr industrialization, because the Ruhr wasn't in Prussia for some of this period, or the Bavarian Industrial Revolution, and you'll see how an industrial revolution can respect people and give them great advantages. If you compare that with the Prussian and certainly the English and Scottish Industrial Revolution, you'll find a much more cynical attitude of deliberately putting people in slums and not improving their lot. Or in the case of some apparently enlightened Christian bosses, such as Quakers, whatever. You've got examples of those villages. Crossmaglen, I think, is one, isn't it? Or one of those in South Armagh, or Bourneville in Birmingham. It's said to be better than what else was on offer, but again, it tells people that you're really just a number. You don't have any individuality. Your house is exactly like the one next door. You do the same things as them at the same times. This creates a hive mind, and it was deliberately because the Industrial Revolution, for most of the Western world, those parts that were controlled by Aristotelian or Platonist elitists, what it was about was telling people you don't have traditions, you don't have regional identity, you don't have family identity anymore. You're just workers.
Now, that seems to be part of the whole thing about the University of Western England at Bristol. They're talking about mass particle optimization, swarm technology, and I mean, that seems to be hive mind control.
Well, look at Martin Edwards, a writer on the ukcolumn.org website. You have to search around a bit to find some of his articles. Some of them are in series. But he writes about Bristol's role as England's, or indeed the whole of the UK's, first smart city, and how the mayor, Mr. Rees, is talking continually about making Bristol smart and cooperating with tech and university sectors to create an entirely new way of life in the city.
Is that not also where the slaves went out, slave trade?
Yes, it is. And, it's quite a powerful location in many ways. I think, those who want to look into the who are suitably qualified might want to think about the power of the Avon and the tidal range of the Severn slightly further down as well. There certainly seems to be something very energetic about the area.
Wow, exciting. So do you have any work that people could look at on your website? I mean, any place that people could see you to get more information or talk to you?
Well, my time, sadly, is too limited to maintain my own website. I do write rather fewer than I'd want, but I do write some articles for ukcolumn.org, where they can all be found there. Many of the talks I give, such as an interview like this, is really, I know that some people would mock me for saying things I can't substantiate here, but it's deliberately thinking out loud and trying to fertilize other people's minds so that they can start thinking for themselves. I'm deliberately regurgitating here things that I've only really heard passively, thought about, and thought, well, let's keep this as a hypothesis and see where it leads us. So a lot of this stuff is work in progress, really, and I've deliberately restricted myself to only UK column appearances and articles and AV9 or AV generally, because that is really a way of concentrating the few hours I have into something that perhaps it makes more sense, is more cogent.
Well, that's very positive, and I'm very happy that we've been able to have this discussion this evening.
Thank you. It's remarkable that we come to similar conclusions in some ways from having read very different material, but the truth is one, as they say. And so certainly if the fabric of the universe is as it is, then it doesn't matter what tradition you approach it from, you're going to end up in the same place, aren't you?
Well, is it it's not true that all roads lead to Rome, or is it Dublin?
Certainly these days all roads lead to Dublin with the amount of motorway construction they've been financing, but I think all that's coming to a close now.
Yeah, huge developments over there. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been a great discussion, and also your guys at the UK column. And just really briefly, what do they do in terms of bulletins and information, just to give them a shout out at this time?
What UK column now does, you can find them on YouTube, or best is to become a subscriber or donor to ukcolumn.org directly to join the forums there and to get extra information which isn't available to the general public that way. UK column now produces a Monday, Wednesday and Friday lunchtime news at 1 o'clock British time. Tends to go on for 3/4 of an hour. We produce occasional audiovisual specials called Insight or Insight Vox, and we're now in the process of relaunching our print, but we're now going into more of a high production value occasional magazine format, which we hope will carry some authors of perhaps even more heavy-hitting material than we've had in the past.
Well, I think Nexus Magazine was advised how to do that by the late Graham Birdsall, who got UFO Magazine out there, the British side of UFO Magazine. How do you get your publication into the shops? How do people get it? How do you get it there?
We rely entirely on word of mouth and local volunteers and enthusiasts to get the publication out. We're not at all elitist, but we do have an attitude that the magazine will find its way to where it needs to be. I think all five of us, the two Davids, Brian, Mike, and I, have got a slightly different take on this, but we kind of overlap with this idea that if it's meant to get to the people that need to know about it, it will. And that does tend to happen. And we do hope that particularly the column, as we're now going to call it, the print magazine, is going to circulate perhaps a little more widely in the corridors of power in Westminster than elsewhere, put it that way.
Interesting. Well, let's wish you the best luck on that. And thank you very much for joining us on Basis 93, I think it is.
You're very welcome, Miles. Thanks for the opportunity.
And no doubt we'll see you with the lovely Caroline in some other place or other.
I expect so.
Thank you.
Cheers.